Welcome back to Kafka Internal's Crashcasts. I'm Sheila, and with me, as always, is the Kafka wizard himself, Victor. Today, we're diving into the exciting world of setting up a Kafka cluster. This is part of our Basic Operations chapter in our Young Padawan season. Victor, are you ready to guide our listeners through the cluster setup process?
Absolutely, Sheila. I'm excited to help our listeners understand how to get a Kafka cluster up and running. It's a crucial step in harnessing the power of Kafka for any organization.
Before we jump in, let's start with a quick quiz for our listeners. Here's the question. What's the minimum number of brokers recommended for a production Kafka cluster, and why? Think about it, and we'll reveal the answer at the end of the episode.
That's a great question, Sheila. It really makes you think about the core principles of distributed systems and fault tolerance. I'm sure our listeners will have some interesting thoughts on this.
Now, let's set the stage for our listeners. We've already covered what Kafka is and its core concepts in previous episodes. For today's topic, it's important to remember that Kafka works with multiple servers called brokers and uses Zookeeper or K-Raft for coordination. Victor, could you give us a quick refresher on why we need a cluster instead of just a single server?
Certainly, Sheila. A Kafka cluster, as opposed to a single server, provides scalability, fault tolerance, and high availability. It's like having multiple libraries in a city instead of just one. If one library is closed or too busy, you can always go to another. In Kafka terms, if one broker goes down, the others can take over its work, ensuring your data streaming continues uninterrupted.
That's a great analogy, Victor. So let's start with the basics. What are the first steps in setting up a Kafka cluster?
The first step is to ensure you have the necessary hardware and software. You'll need multiple servers or virtual machines to act as your brokers. Each should have sufficient CPU, RAM, and most importantly, fast storage. SSDs are recommended for production environments. As for software, you'll need to install Java, as Kafka runs on the Java virtual machine, and then download and extract the Kafka distribution on each server.
I see. So once we have our hardware and software ready, what's next? I imagine we need to do some configuration, right?
Exactly, Sheila. Configuration is crucial. The main configuration file for Kafka is called server.properties. You'll need to edit this file on each broker, setting unique broker IDs and specifying the Zookeeper connection string. You'll also want to configure things like the log directory, where Kafka will store its data, and the listeners, which define the protocols and ports Kafka will use for communication.
That sounds like a lot to keep track of. Are there any common pitfalls or misconceptions people have when setting up their first cluster?
One common mistake is underestimating the importance of proper disk I/O. People often focus on CPU and RAM, but Kafka is heavily dependent on input/output operations. Another is not properly configuring replication factors and partition counts. Remember, replication is key to fault tolerance, but it also impacts performance and storage requirements.
Speaking of replication, could you explain a bit more about how that works in a Kafka cluster setup?
Certainly. Replication in Kafka involves creating copies of partitions across different brokers. When you create a topic, you specify a replication factor. For example, with a replication factor of 3, each partition of the topic will have 3 copies, each on a different broker. This ensures that if one or even 2 brokers fail, your data is still available. It's like having multiple copies of the same book in different libraries across the city.
That's a great explanation, Victor. Now, I'm curious about real-world implementations. Can you give us an example of how a company might set up their Kafka cluster?
Sure, Sheila. Let's take a hypothetical e-commerce company. They might start with a cluster of 5 brokers, each on separate physical servers. They'd likely have a mix of topics, some with high replication factors for critical data like orders and payments, and others with lower replication for less critical data like product views. They might also set up multiple data centers for disaster recovery, using Kafka's multi-data center replication feature.
That's fascinating, Victor. As we're nearing the end of our episode, could you share some best practices for setting up a Kafka cluster?
Absolutely. First, always use odd numbers of Zookeeper nodes and Kafka brokers to avoid split-brain scenarios. Second, plan your capacity carefully. It's better to have some headroom than to run out of resources. Third, use monitoring tools from the start to keep an eye on your cluster's health. And finally, document your setup thoroughly. It'll save you headaches down the line.
Those are great tips, Victor. Now, let's reveal the answer to our quiz question. What's the minimum number of brokers recommended for a production Kafka cluster, and why?
The recommended minimum is 3 brokers for a production Kafka cluster. This allows for proper replication and fault tolerance. With 3 brokers, you can have a replication factor of 3 for your topics, meaning each partition has 3 copies. This ensures that even if one broker fails, you still have 2 copies of your data, and Kafka can continue to operate normally.
Thank you, Victor. To wrap up, let's summarize the main points we covered today. 1. Setting up a Kafka cluster involves preparing hardware, installing software, and careful configuration. 2. Proper disk, I/O, replication, and partition configuration are crucial for performance and fault tolerance. 3. Real-world implementations often involve multiple brokers across different data centers. 4. Best practices include using odd numbers of nodes, planning capacity, implementing monitoring, and thorough documentation. In our next episode, we'll be diving into creating topics in Kafka. Until then, keep streaming and don't forget to subscribe and rate our podcast if you're enjoying the content. This is Sheila, signing off.